one thing I know, I was talking to my good friend Julie Hughes in the audience, and she was talking about, I'm sitting here as a member of the community asking myself, what can I do? All of these experts on the stage are so amazing and they're so powerful, but I am moved as a citizen of this community. What can I do? So this panel is the answer to that question. These are people who have done just some just truly remarkable work in this field, and we're so blessed to have them here. Where's Justin? Okay, you're going to take the podium. And it is chaired by my friend and colleague, Justin Herdman.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Justin Herdman. You may remember me from yesterday. I'm the Cleveland Browns fan.
Clicker.
I don't, is this it? Okay, here you go. And this panel actually is starting to look like the Cleveland Browns injured list for this week, so it's that big. But we're very, very lucky to have them here to speak about a subject that is very close to my heart as a former law enforcement official, which is community preparedness. And so we have a variety of leaders in this field representing a number of different communities and a number of different work streams in community preparedness. You know, when I was U.S. Attorney, one of the most poignant moments that I would ever have in any setting was getting with a community that was under threat. It could have been a Jewish community, it could have been a Muslim community, it could have been a group of inner city pastors, all of whom perceived some threat to their community. And the most important thing that would come out of those meetings wasn't necessarily what we talked about, although that was important, but it was really just getting to know each other, to know first names, to exchange phone numbers, and to ensure that we knew who to call in the event that something happened. And I think you're going to hear that. I suspect you'll hear that several times here this morning. Part of my job as a moderator is also to provide a quote, I think. I've heard that several times here this week. So I happened to notice one from Abraham Lincoln that I thought was fitting. He said, if you give me 6 hours to fell a tree, I'll spend 4 hours sharpening the blade of my axe. And I think that that's exactly what preparedness is all about. It's about being ready in the event that you're called upon to act and to protect. So we're going to go in fairly rapid-fire format here because of the importance of the topics and the number of speakers that we have. And I will introduce our first panelist, Christy Edwards. Christy will be leading us off. Go ahead, Christy.
Thanks. And I do have a PowerPoint. Oh, I've already skipped ahead. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Christy Edwards. I am the deputy head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the OSCE. That's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in our Office for Democratic. Oh, I'm going to hit that. Okay, in the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, Poland. It's a bit of a mouthful, but for those of you who are not familiar with the OSCE, it is one of the largest regional, well, it is the actual largest regional security organizations. It's a multilateral organization comprised of 57 participating states, including the United States, Canada, all of Europe, and all of Central Asia. And our mandate is to work on security issues, a variety of security issues all across the region. And my office in particular is mandated to assist all of the participating states in upholding those commitments. These are not legally binding commitments, they are political commitments, but range on a number of different topics, including hate crimes, which is what my department in particular works on. So just to give you a very quick overview, and we can talk about this perhaps a little bit later this afternoon in the deep dive, we have a number of tools and resources, trainings that we provide to communities, to law enforcement, prosecutors around different aspects of hate crime. We have a number of them specifically related to combating anti-Semitism, which I've put on the screen for you, although it seems probably microscopic from here. So if you can't read it, I'm happy to go into a little bit of detail. But we have a number of fact sheets, trainings, guides for police and communities to work on different forms of security, specifically for Jewish communities. And we have some similar tools also for combating discrimination against Muslims. Muslims. My department works on racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, combating intolerance against Muslims, working with Christian community faith groups, and a number of other communities. So we have specifically dedicated tools and resources for all of these communities, as well as a broader scope of tools, including our trainings for police. This is our TACKLE program, or Training Against Hate Crimes for Law Enforcement, where we go in and train law enforcement officials specifically on how to recognize, address, investigate hate crimes on a wide variety of biases. We also do a similar training for prosecutors in our PACT program, where we, again, help them work with police as the investigations are going along, but then work with them on specific charging aspects, and hopefully working with judges as well on the sentencing aspects. And then with our civil society colleagues, we have a number of resources and programs and trainings on coalition building, because it's not enough, as I'm sure all of you in this room know, to address just one aspect of hate crimes or hate crimes against one particular community. But when communities join together to tell the government, to tell the general public that hate crimes against any community is absolutely unacceptable, it creates a much, much stronger message, and of course the same kind of message that we're all here to share today. This goes into a little bit more on the coalition building, but maybe I'll skip that for this afternoon session just to make sure we have enough time. And then one of the other aspects of my department's work is that we put together the largest source of hate crime data in the world that we release every year on November 16th, which is the National Day, or International Day of Tolerance. And we release data for the year prior. So this coming November, we will release the 2020 data. But just a quick overview of the 2019 data findings. Out of the 57 participating states, we had 39 states that contributed to the report. Many of them did share their data that was broken down and statistics broken down by bias motivation, so we know how many hate crimes were committed against Jewish communities or Muslim communities or LGBT communities, etc. We also receive a significant amount of data coming from civil society organizations, where many times people will not go to the police out of fear for a wide variety of reasons, but they will share with their local civil society organization that might be able to provide some resources there. Just a really quick overview. Again, we can talk about this a little bit later this afternoon, but we can break it down, and if you go on our website, you can see the numbers of hate crimes by community as they're reported to us, and the types of crimes that they occur, whether it's a violent crime, a threat, community property damage, etc. And then finally, this is, again, just another breakdown of the types of data that we receive, which shows the numbers of crimes committed against or with certain types of bias motivations. So racism and xenophobia tends to be the largest sector of data that we receive. Anti-Semitism, of course, is another really huge one. Bias against LGBT individuals or based on sexual orientation and gender identity, etc. So happy to chat more about some of this data, but I won't bore you with numbers and data that quite so early this morning in great detail, as I'm sure many of our colleagues on the panel today have a number of stories that they'd like to share with you about the actual impact of these issues in their communities.
Thank you, Christy. Michael?
Going to see if you were going to toss that to me.
I was thinking about it.
If I'm on the Cleveland Browns or the Pittsburgh Steelers for that.
Go ahead. Michael Masters, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here, and I want to thank the organizers, and it's always great to be in Pittsburgh, a city that really demonstrates resiliency and strength. I serve as the National Director and CEO for the Secure Community Network. We serve as the official safety and security organization of the Jewish community across North America. Our mission is simple. It is to ensure the safety and security as well as resiliency of the Jewish community. By way of history, we were formed in 2004 in conversations between the FBI and the Jewish community leadership, a recognition that there needed to be a group of security professionals that could take the threats that were coming into the Jewish community and then work with the community itself. Frankly, we did most of that work pretty quietly for 15 years until the threat dynamic required us not to be so quiet and required us to be more proactive. And we've been working over the last 3 years to really be more engaged and more out there. And one of the prime examples of that is here in Pittsburgh, the community security program that the Jewish Federation, under Jeff Finkelstein's leadership, implemented in 2017, prior to the attack here, demonstrates that sense of preparedness and proactivity that we're trying to replicate across the country. We spent a lot of time talking yesterday about the threat dynamic. I don't want to dive into it too deeply, except to say that we work with the FBI on a regular, ongoing basis, and the assessment that we've come up with the Bureau and the Department of Homeland Security, just to encapsulate it, is that we are living in the most complex and dynamic threat environment facing the Jewish community and our country than at any time in this nation's history. And that is because the diversity of ideologies that are confronted against the Jewish community, as well as other communities of faith, as well as the threat vectors that they operate in, from online spaces to physical security. And that really requires us to be proactive, because people always ask, what's the greatest threat? And I firmly believe it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not ISIS, it's not even white supremacists. This is a posting from a new parent school chat board for a Jewish day school in a major city. And if you read it, it gives you the sense of anxiety that can exist within a community. Our greatest enemy is our own unwillingness to confront the fear that exists within the community. We will do more damage as a faith-based community, as a Jewish community or a Muslim community, a Hindu community, when our own community members, out of fear of harassment, of violence, choose not to walk into our institutions, choose not to send their kids to Jewish day camp or Jewish day school, than any terrorist could ever hope to accomplish. The danger is real, but fear is a construct, and preparedness is power. And what we need to do is work to empower our community, and we're seeing the impacts of that when we don't do it on everywhere from our college campuses to our camps in statements such as this. So let me talk a little bit about how we're working to do that. One of the things that we do is we work to catalog all the Jewish assets around the country. We roughly estimate there's a minimum of 12,000 brick and mortar facilities. And one of the incredible collective strengths, but also a potential weakness of our community, is when something happens, whether it's in Pittsburgh or Poway, we receive it as a whole community. And when something happens to other faith-based community, when the Christchurch happened in New Zealand, Salam and I were in contact, and when Pittsburgh happened, he and I spoke. Coming together as different faith-based communities, an attack on any of us, regardless of where we are, is an attack on all of us, which means we need to build a security shield over the entirety of the Jewish community in North America and more broadly our faith-based community. So in 2017, only 7% of Jewish communities across this country had access to a professional security director like Brad Orsini, who is the Federation Security Director here in Pittsburgh. And there were gaps in how we were developing training and exercise, our intelligence and information sharing. We've been working to correct that, and we developed a model based off working with the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and local organizations and conversations with communities like here in Pittsburgh to build a model that we would go into a community, assess the community, identify the strengths and weaknesses, and raise the standard of every institution. Now that's going to look different for a Chabad house than an independent Jewish day school, but that old phrase, you don't have to run faster than the bear, just faster than the other guy, does not work in community preparedness with the faith-based community. We all need to run fast together, and we are working to raise that standard every single day through intelligence and information sharing, which I'll come back to, physical security and emergency preparedness, training and exercise, and incident response. We saw the value of that here. The security director, Brad Orsini, trained over 6,000 members of the Pittsburgh community from January 2017 till the day of the attack here in October 2018. Driven by the Federation, to include doing training at the Tree of Life building less than 8 weeks before the attack. And we know from the witness testimony that that training helped save lives that day. That is the real impact we can have when we engage the community in these efforts. And we have to think about the diversity of that community. It's not just our houses of worship, but it's our senior centers, it's our community offices, it's our college campuses, our camps. One of the things that we've worked to do is distinguish this with a professional approach. So we are recruiting men and women from law enforcement who have served the community for decades to come in and act as community security directors to provide the professional leadership to then engage the community. Just this past year during COVID, we trained over 17,000 members of the Jewish community around this country, mostly online, and we opened the doors to other faith-based communities. We can have the demonstrable impact. We can work to empower the community. We can replace that sense of fear with a sense of awareness and strength. One thing I really want to touch on based on the conversation yesterday is intelligence information sharing. When a community, usually through a federation, creates one of these community security initiatives, we see a 78% increase in incident reporting. That doesn't mean that incidents go up. It means that the community is being socialized to report them, which allows our partners in federal law enforcement, state and local law enforcement to report them and act on them. And this is vital. You know, Jonathan, yesterday in his remarks, Greenblatt, related to the landscape of hate crimes reportings. We have over 70 cities in this country of populations of over 100,000 or more that report 0 hate crimes. I don't think there is any one of us in this room that believes that there is not a hate crime happening in those cities. We have gaps that we as a community need to step forward and demand better results with, and that starts with us being proactive in reporting. So that's why we created our Operations Command Center, which you can see a picture of in Chicago, which is doing incident tracking, reporting, in coordination with state, local, federal law enforcement and partners like the ADL and others. This is our common operating picture, which identifies all of those 12,000 assets across this community, geofences them, monitors surface, deep, and dark web, provides notifications to the community and our community security directors. And it's having impact. In just the first 4 weeks we were using this, when the attack happened in Muncie, New York, we were aware of that attack about 10 minutes before it hit social media because of Project RAIN, Real-Time Actionable Intelligence Network, which is made possible thanks to the dedication and commitment and partnership with members of this community and with the Federation here. Today, 100% of communities across the Jewish world have access to our duty desk and access to a professional resource through SCN, through and with our federations around the country. And we are increasing that shield every day, but it requires all of us. This is about solutions. We can have the conversation all day long about why people hate us, and I'm happy to have it. For 3,000 years, it's been an ongoing conversation, but to have that conversation, we need to make sure as a community we are alive, safe, and secure, and people can walk into our institutions, and that we can lock the door and have safety and security. Then we can have that conversation. But it starts with the safety and security first and foremost, and that's what we're working to commit to do in partnership with our other faith-based communities and certainly with the public sector and all of you.
Thank you, Michael. Next is Jennifer Sierdelli, sitting next to Michael. Jennifer?
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Good morning. I'm Jen Sierdelli. I'm here with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is our nation's living memorial to the Holocaust located in Washington, D.C. Before I start, I do want to recognize all of those with us who have experienced these personal tragedies and those who have so painfully spoken out. None of them asked to be in those situations. A number of them did choose to speak publicly, whether it's in educational talks or through our judicial system. And the courage to share these stories is really at the heart of everything we do here, and they're just constant reminders of the humanity in this work. So I am just always in awe and appreciation and gratitude for people who are willing to share those most terrible moments so that we can learn and try and do better. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, just a little context of the institution. We're congressionally mandated. We are a public education institution. It was decided early on that being a memorial was not enough. We would be a memorial museum so that we would have an educational component to the work. The vision of the museum is to ensure the prominence of Holocaust memory, understanding, and relevance. We envision a world where leaders and individuals work to combat hatred, to prevent genocide, and to promote human dignity. We are pretty big. We have a variety of agencies or elements, centers that I do want to just put on our radar. We have an Institute for Documentation that preserves the evidence, whether it's artifacts or documents, photographs, films that are then increasingly made publicly available. We have a Center for Research, which is to take all of that evidence and to better understand how this massive event of the Holocaust was able to occur. We have a Center for Prevention of Genocide, which was part of our original Living Memorial mandate to look to the contemporary and to work to prevent these sorts of situations again. And we have our Education Center, which is where I sit. The Education Center houses our exhibitions, our educational initiatives, our digital presence, which includes our Holocaust Encyclopedia. In the fiscal year 2021, our Holocaust Encyclopedia had 20.4 million unique visitors from in English and 18 additional languages. We work with teachers, we work with educators from Holocaust centers, we work with youth, but I'm actually here to talk about our work with professionals, which I think is some of the most surprising work. People aren't always aware that the museum has a pretty robust and dynamic engagement with what we say professionals who protect life and liberty, so police, including law enforcement, but also law enforcement more broadly, such as analysts and agents at the FBI, for example, the judiciary, predominantly judges, but also prosecutors, military, predominantly officers, and select government professionals. We work mostly domestically, although we do have an emerging global presence, working with some global criminal justice actors and international military professionals. So I'll do, in this afternoon session, I'll talk a little bit more about our pedagogy and how, like, kind of in the weeds about our programming. But basically, in our educational institution, we're trying to examine how and why this event happened. We don't start at Auschwitz or with war or the mass killing. We examine the process that got there, because that is an element of where the learning is. How is it that a society transforms? Who needs to be involved? What are the dynamics at play? What are the various motivations and pressures? So we try to create educational resources that allow people coming from so many different walks of life to examine this history in relevant ways. So the work that we do with professionals, we end up tailoring our programs to the profession with whom we're working. So if we're working with police, we'll examine the role of the German police during the 1930s and 40s. It's apples and oranges. We're not saying, oh, look, this context is just like what, the United States in 2021. They're different, but there is something about human behavior, about the role of professionals, about individual decision-making that transcends time, and it's the humanity in the story. So we tailor the programs for each of the professionals, and I think I've got time for one quick case study. We work with case studies, so we try to illustrate the role that that institution was playing as the context around them changed, and then what that meant for individual professionals who were in that context. We're examining choices, we're examining motivations and pressures, and we're trying to create an environment where the professionals in the room can take a moment out of their crazy day-to-day busy realities to stop and reflect on this historical moment in a way that allows them also to think, okay, so why is this relevant for me? What's interesting about this for the challenges and opportunities I experience in my day-to-day? We're often combating kind of myths about it. People will say, oh, well, people had to do what they did or else they would have been shot or they were all brainwashed. So one case study, it's one we use with the military, factual, been researched, and highlighted for us from a colonel, because in the Army, we create our resources with professionals who can speak to how the materials will resonate. So this case study, 1941, occupied Belarusia, the front of the German Army has moved forward. The German Army, this infantry regiment is staying behind. They're not Nazis, they're German professionals. They're not part of that ideological group. And the major gives an order that 3 company commanders should shoot the Jewish civilians under their jurisdiction out of fear of a partisan threat or a partisan uprising. So we pose that case study with historical documents and primary source materials for analysis to the professionals in the room, and they can discuss, oh, well, what did the 3 do? Do they do the same thing? Conventional wisdom would say, well, yes. In fact, one of the company commanders carries out the killings immediately. The third company commander hesitates. He ends up having his NCO, his senior enlisted officer, carry it out while he stays in the office. The remaining company commander doesn't carry it out at all. And he ends up saying afterwards, well, I didn't actually perceive that community to be a military threat. So then that opens a conversation with these professionals. How is it that these three individuals in the same, essentially the same context, even though they're in geographic space, different geographic spaces, what motivated them? What were the pressures? How was individual discretion possible? And that historical analysis opens a door to conversation about motivations, pressures, careerism, peer pressure, relationship with the commanding officer, the environment of the culture within which they're operating. And those are the types of conversations we're trying to seek. So as an institution, we're trying to create educational experiences that resonate with people in the room and allow them to piece through and puzzle through the human dynamics at play so that they can better understand how it is that these events that seem so massive and so out there, it's hard for us to conceive the reality of an Auschwitz, but we can conceive the reality of an unjust law about which a judge has jurisdiction over deciding a case. And that's what we try to do. I'll say I can tell much more in our session this afternoon, but I'll stop there. We've worked with over 240,000 professionals, and then I'll stop. There's so much more, and thank you for listening.
Well, we may have time at the end, so I might get back to you, Jennifer, but that's very interesting. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Reverend Cassandra Bledsoe.
Good morning.
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 My name is Reverend Cassandra Bledsoe. I am here with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. But before I talk about NOBLE, I'm going to talk about my job with the City of Cleveland, where I serve as the community liaison to the Chief of Police for the City of Cleveland. And in that role, it's my job or my responsibility to make sure that the Office of the Police Chief gets into the community. How I got into that role is when we went under consent decree and we got the opportunity to talk to the public with several different working groups and meetings. And one of the things that came out from talking with people is that there was no one in the Office of the Police Chief to communicate with the community. So we had community policing, we had community relations in City Hall, but we wanted someone in the office to be able to go back and forth with the police chief. And so that's how I ended up there. To my knowledge, I was the first in the country of having that. I am not a sworn law enforcement official. I have a civil rights background where I previously worked with our law enforcement agency, the city and other law enforcement agencies in monitoring and investigating hate crimes throughout the city of Cleveland. I was also the administrator of the Office of Professional Standards. But I want to talk briefly about a very simple program when we look at programs and talk about hate crimes that was implemented, or I created and implemented with our police chief and then with all of the other agencies throughout the city of Cleveland. It's a simple program called Tea with the Chief. And if you know the slang with tea is that you get the information, it's a spinoff of Coffee with a Cop. What it does is that it started out with our police chief after we had a police shooting where we had several huge, large community events, and everyone was screaming and shouting, and I noticed that our chief could not hear them or understand them because of just the passion and the emotion with everybody. So the first tea with the chief, we met at a home of a senior citizen, and he went into that home and sat on the living room couch, and that's how it began, is that the community could not believe that the police chief would come into my home and sit on my couch. As a result of that, we've been all over the city of Cleveland, bringing in every law enforcement agency and community partner that was available who wanted to participate, including our U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, the ATF, down to our local sheriff, the NAACP, women's leagues, children, you name it, refugees, the children of refugees, and of course, our houses of worship. We've met all over the city of Cleveland, from the living room couch to the lake house, to private meetings. And that's what leads me to NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. The same thing has transpired with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. We are known worldwide for our training, second to none, I would like to say. where we train our officers not only to train for hate crimes and other bias-motivated incidents, but our officers, we are justice by action and going into the home, going into the street, and getting to know people. And across the board, no matter who you are, breaking bread together says, I like this person. When I was with Noble as the national chaplain in 2019, I had the honor and the privilege to serve on the Committee of Targeted Violences Against the Houses of Worship. We did the exact same thing. We sat at the table, people from every faith, people from multidisciplinary, people, Salam and others who knew and who had passion and who already were in their communities, already voices for the houses of worship. And we left from the table in Washington, D.C. and traveled across the United States and entered into houses of worship that were targeted and were victims of violence, senseless hate crimes in the United States. There's one thing to sit in the classroom. There's another thing to sit in the big conference room in Washington, D.C. But when we got off that plane and was greeted and went into the houses of worship across the board, although we made many recommendations, personally as a reverend, I came away regardless of whatever faith and whoever you were, I say, the people of faith are under attack. People of faith are under attack. And what do we do about that in the United States? Regardless of what house of worship that we went into, my heart went out for the children, the women, the men who suffered, who tried to protect. And so I'm happy to be here today because my passion, yes, I work in law enforcement. And yes, we will talk a little bit this afternoon more about that, of working in law enforcement and they being the first responders, and what does that mean? When they're there also, but yet after the incident, they're treated a little different just because of their job. Again, people of faith are under attack. I want to talk about that, and I want to thank Pittsburgh for how beautiful you've grown. There's a saying that says, don't waste your pain, and you have not wasted your pain here in Pittsburgh, and it is marvelous to see what God is doing through everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Bledsoe. Next, let's go to Salam AlMariati.
Thank you. My name is Salam AlMariati, President of Muslim Public Affairs Council. I had the honor of serving with Cassandra on a faith-based advisory committee with the Department of Homeland Security, where we published the report on targeted violence against houses of worship. And I think from that experience, we drew three main lessons. The first lesson is that every community, and I think for the Muslim community, this is the hardest to do really, and that is to develop a relationship with law enforcement. Because, for example, we were in Minneapolis for one of our visits, and there was a mosque that was attacked by a white militia group based out of Ohio, and it drove all the way to Minneapolis to bomb the mosque there. And when the mosque called law enforcement, they said, we felt that we were treated as the suspects, not as the victims. And so I think that's very important to understand the sentiment of communities when you talk about partnerships. That partnership with law enforcement is critical, but they need to be treated as partners, not suspects. And for American Muslims, we have to deal with that all the time. I was just talking to Michael when we went to the White House in 2015. We were there for a summit like this in the White House, and that night Fox News decided to run a story on me that the president invited a terrorist to the White House. And Muslims have to deal with that every day. And I think understanding that psychology or the trauma in dealing with that issue is very important if we want to develop a healthy relationship with law enforcement, which obviously is a must if we want to deal with this threat. You cannot do this alone. You have to do this with law enforcement. So I think that relationship building is important, and thank God that we have partners like Michael, like Cassandra, like the people on this in this panel, like all of you, because we could not do it without you. And so developing that relationship together with partners like you is very, very important with law enforcement. Number two is the issue of the security apparatus, infrastructure, and financing. There are the haves and the have-nots. Again, we were in Jackson, Mississippi with this faith-based group, meeting with black churches. About 300 leaders came to meet with us, and they said that the federal government had only allocated $40,000 over 5 states in that region for security of houses of worship. And that is not just abysmal, that is practically a sin. We cannot continue with a policy of that inequity in dealing with the threats to our communities like that. So there needs to be more equitable distribution of whatever funding there is, and definitely there needs to be an increase in funding. But more importantly, we found out that there's protective security advisors that the Department of Homeland Security sends out, and you can get these free security assessments for houses of worship. Our community had no idea of that. And on top of that, there aren't enough protective security advisors that go around our country. I think in California there are only 3. So if we want to be serious about securing houses of worship, we definitely need to increase the number of protective security advisors around our country. Now in Minneapolis, when we went to the mosque there, they didn't know anything about a protective security advisor. They didn't know anything about funding. It was the Jewish Federation that developed a relationship with the mosque that helped them understand how to go through the process and actually end up getting funding for their mosque. So that relationship and support with and from the Jewish Federation was critical in terms of developing the security of that Muslim community in Minneapolis. And it just also underscores the point that we're in this together. And unfortunately, this manifests itself in tragedies like the Tree of Life incident here in Pittsburgh. The attack was against a Jewish center, but the narrative was that it was a Jewish financier that was supporting Muslim terrorists infiltrating our southern border. So we see, unfortunately, that connectedness in that kind of conspiracy theory. When we went to Poway in San Diego, we found out that the same attacker that shot people in the synagogue in Poway was the same person who firebombed the mosque 10 miles down the street. And he invoked New Zealand. So we are tied at the hip in terms of dealing, we're joined at the hip in terms of dealing with this threat. We are in this together as Semites, as people of faith, as Americans, as human beings. I think that just underscores that we have to come up with solutions together. And I'm very happy to see the kind of work, for example, what Christy presented in terms of dealing with the hate that is affecting all of us, not just one community. At the end of the day, we can talk about high tech, more cameras, developing our infrastructure. We can talk about funding and policies, and talk about civil rights encroachment and preservation of civil liberties. We can talk about raising awareness and better PR, but nothing is going to replace the community partnership, and that's the third and most important point. The community partnerships are the most important elements in surviving this threat and growing as a nation. As I said, what happened in Minneapolis underscored this community partnership between Jews and Muslims. When we went to Jackson, Mississippi, and what Cassandra's doing underscored the partnership between black churches, mosques, synagogues, and all people of faith. We cannot just talk about money and increasing security without a movement for pluralism. And that is the most important element of our work. It has to be about building movement and building community and building partnerships. We have to underscore the point that comes from all of our scriptures, that each and every human being is a partner with one another, and we are all protectors for one another. So when a mosque is attacked, or a synagogue, or a church, or a Hindu temple, or a Sikh temple, or whatever, we are there as that first line of defense, forming a human chain and creating a political voice on behalf of whoever is targeted. And that way, we see the beginning of a movement where religious ethics overcomes religious nationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salam. Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Michael Duffin. Michael?
Thank you. I'm Michael Duffin with the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism. The White House has made combating anti-Semitism and domestic terrorism top priorities. The State Department, in coordination with our interagency counterparts, is using every diplomatic tool at our disposal to address the international aspects of these threats. As Secretary Blinken said last week, it's important that we stay vigilant and relentless in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate, as individuals, countries, and coalitions of countries standing together. In addition to tools that target terrorist financing, travel, and operations, we are supporting community-focused programs overseas that empower local stakeholders to work with each other and their national governments to build the resilience of vulnerable individuals and groups. For example, our programs promote critical thinking in Jordan, interfaith dialogue in Morocco, rehabilitation and reintegration in Kazakhstan. In Bangladesh and Indonesia, we're supporting a program called Mother Schools, where we educate parents about the warning signs of radicalization. In France and Slovakia, we're supporting a program called Invent to Prevent, which empowers university students to develop messaging campaigns that combat extremism that's on their campuses and in their communities. For this panel, I do want to focus on our efforts to support local governments, local policymakers. In 2015, the State Department helped launch the Strong Cities Network, which is a global network focused on local government's role in preventing and countering violent extremism. There are more than 150 members globally. In the US, this includes Atlanta, Chattanooga, Los Angeles, Louisville, Pittsburgh, and San Diego. There's no cost for cities, counties, and states to join the network, and there are dozens of virtual and in-person events annually. Earlier this year, we organized, in partnership with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a virtual discussion between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and mayors around the world to talk about how kindness and compassion can help address hate and polarization. The Strong Cities Network workshops and exchanges that we support allow members to share best practices and lessons learned with each other. Participants also receive specialized training from network staff and other experts. Through such engagements, cities have developed new programs inspired by other members and acquired a better understanding of the transnational threats they face from violent extremism. The network has also developed lessons learned on how mayors and other local leaders can most effectively respond to acts of violent extremism. To this end, the network published Responding to a Terror Attack, a Strong Cities Toolkit. This report features case studies from around the world, featuring reflections from Mayor Peduto and other mayors and policymakers. The State Department is also supporting two-way exchanges between U.S. cities and counterparts overseas to encourage greater domestic international connectivity. The City Pair program is a twinning exercise which has paired cities such as Chattanooga, Columbus, Las Vegas, Orlando, San Diego, and Seattle with counterparts from overseas. In December, we're bringing a German delegation of local leaders from Halle and Rostock who will spend a week in Atlanta and Savannah learning about U.S. efforts to engage vulnerable youth and protect communities of faith. Some of these exchanges have also included representatives from the local chapters of MPAC, ADL, and other organizations. Then in March, we're going to bring a delegation from Atlanta and Savannah to Germany to essentially look under the hood to see what the German communities are doing right, the areas where they could improve, and these programs are very effective and successful. One example, in 2015, there was a municipality in Belgium called Vilvoorde, which was notorious for the high number of foreign tourist fighters, young people who had left for Syria and Iraq to support ISIS and other jihadist groups. And so they participated in this exchange with Columbus, Ohio. They were updating their strategy at the time and seeing how Columbus was engaging their communities, their young people, gave them a lot of good ideas. And based on the changes that they made, there were no more departures after that point. Not every program is going to be as successful as that, but we've seen how updated strategies and new programs have come about, and partnerships. And it's just to say that by Pittsburgh traveling overseas, a delegation from Pittsburgh traveling overseas to another community, it helps the members of that delegation bond with each other. And so we've seen how a local law enforcement official will work more closely with a rabbi, an imam, a religious leader, because of that, spending that 1 week overseas. I also want to talk about the isolation and anxiety that's been created by the COVID-19 pandemic and protests against mask and vaccine mandates, which have been a shot in the arm for violent white supremacists and other hate groups who prey on vulnerable and naive individuals. We have to scale up these efforts, bring more stakeholders into the fold, and build and maintain networks where policymakers and practitioners can share best practices and lessons learned. The State Department is supporting many of these programs, but we need foundations, the private sector to support these as well. And so I'm happy to talk to you afterwards to exchange business cards, to talk about how the programs that we're doing can also be supported by you. And these are the dots that we have to connect, because there are interested stakeholders. And one example in the front row is Dave Fortier, of One World Strong in Boston. He's a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. He was about to cross the finish line when one of the bombs went off. We connected. He was part of a delegation from Boston that visited Manchester, and he connected with survivors in Quebec, the mosque shooting. And those individuals actually came to Tree of Life in the wake of that attack. And so we're really empowering a lot of well-intentioned individuals. And there are a lot of people in this room who know, Americans who know stakeholders overseas because of State Department exchange programs. So we want to work with you. Let's exchange business cards, and let's find a way to collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, we'll hear from Richard Legault.
Good morning. My name is Rick Legault. I'm the Senior Science Advisor for Social Behavioral Sciences for the Department of Homeland Security. I've been working on this topic of prevention of crimes that are motivated by ideology and grievance pretty actively for violence reduction. I've been studying it for about 20 years, and I've been actively leading research in this area for the department since about 2015. I guess maybe I should start out and just spend a minute talking about what is DHS Science and Technology. That's where I work. I shouldn't have been, but I've been amazed at the number of people I've met and spoken with at the conference who said, "What, you have science and technology at the Department of Homeland Security?" Indeed we do. We are responsible primarily for research and development for what we call the entire Homeland Security enterprise. And what that means to us is not only the components that everybody's aware of that are parts of the Department of Homeland Security, but critical infrastructure and faith-based organizations and NGOs and local community groups, for instance, that are trying to understand the best ways to prevent violence. We also have a number of publicly available guides and documents that are easily found online. We have a tech clearinghouse. So, for instance, if you are interested in investment in security systems, recovery systems, tools, technologies, you can go and see independently evaluated technologies and tools that are we don't, you know, we're kind of like Consumer Reports. We don't make any money on this. We're spending your money, taxpayer money, to be able to give good, solid advice about what's real and what isn't out there. We try to disseminate information as best we can. We have a role in education in the country. We have 9 centers of excellence at universities across the country that study problems that are germane to the Homeland Security landscape, including prevention and counterterrorism and grievance-based violence. But communities, as everybody's talked about here in a lot of our research, are really where it's at, especially if we want to understand prevention. That is where most of my work in this area has focused for a long time. And the one thing that I keep hearing from everyone here at this meeting and all of the speakers that I've heard so far and all of my esteemed colleagues on the stage is that the connections within the communities that you make are highly indicative of the success of your community and the resiliency of your community. And that community forms not just an individual set of security protocols or individual faith communities or police or security or treatment or recovery. It is a system and a network within each community. And the stronger that network is and the better those various parts and pieces know one another prior to an event happening, the greater the likelihood that you might actually prevent the event from happening in the first place. So what can research do for you? What is preparation? I would like to say we prepare for prevention. I get to think about big ideas sometimes. And one of the things that I talk about concerning what science and technology does for the Department of Homeland Security is we make investments. And all of those investments are kind of judged and evaluated based on how much can we invest to get the most out of it to buy down risk from a security standpoint for the United States. That's really what it is. And so when one thinks about a terrible event and the cost of a single event of mass violence in the United States, the prosecutions, the pain, the hospitalizations, the prosecutions, et cetera, over time, and then one looks at what we spend on prevention programming, I would say that we don't have to be scientists to know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we want to get out ahead of that as early in the process as possible. So my office funds work overall in a lot of different areas, but there are 3 sort of categories. We do data collection, we fund data collection and analysis. We try to improve people's capabilities through science. And finally, we invest in evaluation research. And in our later panel, when we go into more detail, I'll talk about really specific examples of work we've done in each of these areas. But essentially, we have data. These data are publicly available that allow you to see what the nature of the problem is geographically in the United States and who we know are committing these types of violent acts and how they're doing it, what the precursors are likely to be, or preparatory actions for attacks. We develop capabilities. We invest in understanding the best way to implement trauma-informed care to help move somebody away from violence if there's a concern that somebody might commit an act of violence, for instance. And evaluation research. And right now, this is probably the largest part of my portfolio. on this topic. We want to systematically understand what works, what doesn't, and what is promising in violence prevention, so that communities can understand as a system how to take on and implement the various things that will work best in their context to have the highest likelihood of preventing an attack early. I think the message to bring back to a community, if people are worried about the 8 million other things they're concerned about other than this, right? This is a big deal to us. It's not at the front of everybody's consciousness all the time, is that action and relationships are important, right? The greatest crimes against humanity are not those crimes of action, but of inaction. And we need to take action now to prevent these things at the beginning, because we know that a single attack tends to drive further additional attacks, and it's best to be avoided. So research, what works, what doesn't, and how we model those things, I hope are vitally important. And one of the things that I think we could take for action to move this forward, to make this better as a group, is to better disseminate that information and make that information clear, available, and understandable to everyone in communities who has a role in implementing community prevention programs and networks. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me tell you why this is such a great panel. It's not because they just stuck the landing on timing. I mean, that was a perfect 10 on timing. It's not that. It's actually the substance of what you just heard here, and I know you guys all agree with me on this. I've been taking notes, and so just from a highlight perspective in my scribbles here, you know, what we heard from Christy was the work that's focused on coalition building and data, and you're going to hear obviously a lot of these are common themes, right? These have run across, you know, every speaker that we've had here. From Michael, I think my main takeaway from that was professionalism. When you look at that Intel Center, I mean, how can you feel anything other than the professionalism that's in play there? From Jennifer, I heard a lot of really interesting points about education and engagement with partners, particularly in law enforcement and the military. From Reverend Bledsoe, we heard a lot about community. We heard a lot about communication and how important that is. And again, like I said, these are all themes that are running across what each of our speakers had to offer. From Salam, very important discussion about relationships, but I thought also the first of our speakers to raise the issue of resources and resourcing. And that's a very, very key component of this, and you heard it from some of the additional speakers as well. From Michael Duffy here, I heard a lot about empowerment and empowering local communities and local and individuals. I think that's key as well. And then lastly here from Richard, a lot about risk management, application of technology, and then ultimately he finished off with the word I underlined twice, which was dissemination. And I think that's great. So the reason that this is such a great panel is that they don't get just one opportunity to speak to you, they get two. And if you've been as impressed with them as I have been, I know that you're going to want to take an opportunity to go at 1 o'clock during the breakout sessions and hear again from all these folks a little bit more detail from each of them about what they do, maybe some of the challenges that they've faced. But please don't miss that, and I'm deeply appreciative for all of your time. Thank you so much. Great job.